Hello, everybody. Long-time viewers of the show know that I've always been interested in the crossover between psychology and real life, between the way in which America is being reshaped by psychologists and psychology. And we have a new book out that I think speaks to this. It's by my guest today, Caroline Fleck, a PhD. She's a clinical psychologist in Silicon Valley, and she has a new book out, Validation: How the Skill Set That Revolutionized Psychology Will Transform Your Relationships, Increase Your Influence, and Change Your Life. And Caroline is joining us from Los Gatos, just down the peninsula. Caroline, congratulations on the new book. What is the skill set that revolutionized psychology? Those are strong words. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I'm referring to a set of validation skills that were introduced actually back in the 90s as part of dialectical behavior therapy. Dialectical behavior therapy is a treatment that was designed to treat folks who were considered among the hardest to treat. That is, those with a condition called borderline personality disorder. And so at the time in the 90s, psychology was very focused on behavioral treatments and cognitive behavioral treatments, very change focused, right? We're going to change how you think, change how you behave. And if we're lucky, that's going to have some effect on how you feel and how you function. What DBT did was it introduced this set of skills that would help therapists also communicate acceptance. Because what we found is that when folks are resistant to change or they don't believe in their capacity to change, they don't respond well necessarily to attempts to change their behavior or thoughts. And so validation was hypothesized to be a method to help therapists kind of improve the rapport, increase willingness to work in therapy by communicating some degree of acceptance, understanding, and empathy. And that proved to be just a huge turning point in the field of clinical psychology. Not only was DBT effective in treating BPD and a range of other disorders, it led to just this really revolution. It's called the third wave of behaviorism. You see all of these different interventions, ACT and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, all these different interventions that are starting to emphasize acceptance and change equally.
Caroline, as I said in the introduction, you are a clinical psychologist with an office in Los Gatos down on the peninsula. Do most of your patients come to you because they want you to help them change their lives? Are people feeling stuck? Is that what the book and your work is all about?
It's certainly what my work is about as a therapist. I don't know if it's necessarily what the book is about. So I'll speak to the first part with regard to my work. I would say that the folks who come to see me are suffering and they feel stuck in that. Often the folks that I treat are suffering from severe psychopathology, suicidality, self-harm, some really nasty stuff. And they're desperate to feel something other than that. Oftentimes, they're also, however, not optimistic in their ability to feel anything other than the suffering that they've experienced for so long.
Let me throw in the A word. It's a word that often comes up in these shows, not just when it comes to mental health, but more broadly in political and economic terms, agency. Is this what your work, both professionally and in this new book, is about, is enabling people to realize agency? It seems to be a particularly sensitive and pertinent subject in the United States because the Republic seems to be founded both on a collective and an ideal of both collective and individual agency.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think my work is And behaviorism in general looks really closely at what are the conditions that are conducive to somebody growing and developing optimally. And we can set those conditions. We can set them in our relationships, and we can control our environment in ways that create the conditions that will bring out the best in us. And validation is absolutely one of those conditions. So, be it in regard to our own experiences, if we are able to validate ourselves, but then also in validating others.
Validation to me, as a non-psychologist, means accepting the views of others, maybe a moral or cultural relativism. Is that the right way of thinking of it, or does it have a technical scientific meaning?
Actually, your definition is a lot closer than what most people I talk to associate with the term validation. They often confuse it with praise. So we say, like, don't seek external validation, which what we're really saying there is don't seek praise from other people, which is a positive judgment, right? If you're excessively seeking praise, you're going to contort yourself in all sorts of ways to get it. Whereas, as you noted, validation is actually much more about acceptance. So, the kind of technical definition is that validation communicates mindfulness, understanding, and empathy in ways that convey acceptance. The easy to remember mantra is validation shows that you're there, you get it, and you care. That's how I think about it.
Caroline, should America be coming to Dr. Fleck? Should America be reading validation? We've done so many shows on the divided nature of this country, the fact that one group doesn't understand another, the coastal elites versus the hinterland, red versus blue America, working class versus middle class America. Is there a broader political and cultural issue at the heart of this book?
Oh my gosh, yes. Um, from where I'm sitting and the work that I do, and what I've seen is that validation has the power to overcome not only conflict, but how to say this, distance. I think oftentimes people think that they need to agree with each other in order to dialogue, or to have a constructive dialogue. And what they don't realize is that you can see the other person's perspective. You can validate another person's perspective, even if you don't agree with it. Okay. I am a vegetarian for ethical reasons. That said, I could easily validate why somebody would be a meat eater. I see the logic in that perspective, and I can open a conversation by attending to that. We don't have to necessarily agree to dialogue. However, our negativity bias makes us much more drawn to what we disagree with, to what we dislike in how somebody is presenting or what they're saying, that we become truly blinded to where we align. And I think that is one of the biggest problems facing this country today. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the media and social media is just um, aggrandizing or exaggerating that signal.
You're a clinical psychologist rather than a social psychologist.
That's right.
There are some people like Jonathan Haidt, who I think is a very prominent social psychologist, who see all this division as a consequence of broader cultural and technological developments. But are you arguing in validation that this can be rooted individually, and if we can all work on our own selves, our own psyches, our own psychologies, we can improve our culture?
There's definitely an argument for that. I think, again, one of the things that stands out to me in my work is that very few of us had self validation modeled for them. Very few of us grew up in families where we were taught and shown by an adult person's behavior what it looked like to validate your own emotions, Instead, we are a very critical culture. We raise kids through a lot of criticism and feedback. We haven't done a great job of providing a template for how you validate your own emotions. And therefore, it's not surprising that people aren't particularly good at it. And that we continue to raise children who aren't particularly good at it.
We did a show last week with my old friend Jonathan Rausch, who has a new book out suggesting that there is an intimacy between democracy and certain kinds of religion, particularly the more tolerant kinds of religion. One he focuses on in his new book, the Mormons, Church of the Latter-day Saints. In your work and in your experience as a clinical psychologist, what is the crossover with traditional religion? Do you think that the church historically has done a reasonable job with validation, or are they one of the problems? Is that one of the reasons why we struggle to validate other people, particularly when it comes to religion, perhaps people of other faiths or people who don't believe?
I mean, even this is such a big question. I'll just, as an aside, say that validation, the techniques that were developed were really born out of Zen Buddhism. And so the researcher, Marshall Linehan, who pioneered this work, became a Zen Buddhist. And she'll, in her work, she talks about the influence that Zen philosophy had on that. Emphasis on acceptance and validation in her work. That being said, what I see more in my clinical practice are the scars of invalidation that people have from oftentimes, not always, certainly not always, but oftentimes it's a relationship with religion that they felt deeply invalidated in or through. So, for instance, homosexual clients who I'm thinking of one client in particular who's also Catholic and really feeling deeply unseen is not the right word. It's bad. It's amoral as a function of who she identifies as and who she is. And I think that profound sense of I am not right, you know, it's hard the church is probably one of the more authoritative systems in our culture to provide that level of a message, that type of a message, right, with such authority. And so I often see the effects of that in adulthood and in adolescents and kids.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up. Rausch himself is a prominent gay marriage rights advocate and a very prominent, I guess, gay American writer, thinker. So, and he brings some of that into the book. Caroline, some people be listening to this and thinking, here we have this therapist in in Los Gatos, just near Stanford University or associated with Stanford University. Classic Northern Californian stuff. She's talking about Zen Buddhism. She's talking about changing your life. She's talking about being open and tolerant, and we're just not into that. Is there a cultural element here? Are you talking universally, or can you yourself be critiqued as culture as opposed to science in terms of transforming your life?
Well, let's see. When I was originally training to become a DBT therapist, when I first learned all this stuff, I would have been a very poor graduate student in North Carolina, originally from the Midwest. So there's definitely like a liberalism, I think, perhaps, to how some of this sounds, but no, I don't think that it is that the science that informs this work is specific to a demographic or is unrelatable. I think that's what is so profound to me about it, is the extent to which validation resonates with everybody. Every single person needs to feel accepted for who they are. And the extent to which they don't is a reflection or represents the degree to which they will suffer. That's not to say they can't overcome that, and there aren't things they can do to mediate that, but it is a universal truth that we seek acceptance from our relationship and our society.
What about the gendered element? We've talked a little bit about class.
Mm.
Some people, again, might be listening and thinking, well, this is a very female attitude. Some men might be saying, well, I don't care what other people think of me. I'm happy with myself. I don't need to be validated by anyone.
Mm.
And of course, I'm sure there are some women who think the same. Is there a gendered quality here? Do you tend to see more men and women in your practice who need or seek validation?
No, I mean, not in those terms. I think that often women are kind of engineered to seek more, not biologically engineered, but as a result of society, have needed to depend on male attention in various ways. And so I think if we're talking about seeking praise or attention, maybe there's some difference there. But validation as I define it, absolutely not. Um, Again, I think it comes down to like every single person. I don't care how macho, whatever you are. No one's going to convince me that they don't want to feel heard by the people that they're around. Um, I don't believe it.
When you say they want to be heard, I mean, it's not literal, is it? I mean, you can shout and then you'd be heard. We know that
Yeah.
on social media. I mean, how would you, I don't want to always bring Trump or Elon Musk into that,
Mm.
but are they the kinds of guys whose behavior reflects our crisis of validation? Do they both shout so loudly because they're desperate to be validated?
I mean, I think that they use invalidation as weapons to silence other people and to get attention. Do I think that they desperately seek validation? Again, I think that they seek fame and adulation. I don't know if they're necessarily after acceptance per se. I think there's a lot more ego in what they're building and seeking that is meaningfully distinct from what I'm talking about.
Is ego, you brought up the E word as
Mm.
opposed to the A word, is ego an enemy of validation? Do you need an ego to be validated or to have real validation? Do you need to get rid of your ego in a good Zen Buddhist kind of way?
Yeah, this is actually a topic I've really wrestled with in my life, to be completely honest, because um, as a student of Zen philosophy myself, there's a heavy emphasis, right, on dismantling the ego and all of the problems inherent in the ego. And yet, we know that people feeling like they belong, people feeling accepted for who they are, is critical to mental health and functioning on a lot of different levels. And I can't pretend to have all of that figured out. What I can say, however, is that I think we are at our best, at our most stable, when we are focused more on validating others than we are on obtaining validation ourselves. I think that is one of the kind of hearts of my message and certainly my book.
So we validate others. Does that mean we all have to have a little bit of Caroline Fleck in us? We may not need PhDs, but
Mhm.
we all need to become psychologists. I mean, can you validate without becoming a psychologist? And in my introduction, I touched on this issue, which for me is interesting in the sense that psychology is increasingly taken for granted. It's almost the replacement for religion in an increasingly secular
Mhm.
culture.
Mm. Again, another good point here. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote this book is because when I learned these skills as a graduate student some 20 years ago, I and I shouldn't just say learn them, but when I really started to master them, to practice them, they really were transformative. And it seemed bananas to me that you would need to get a PhD in clinical psychology to learn this stuff. I mean, this should be taught in grade schools. And at the time, we didn't really even teach these skills to patients. These were just seen as skills that therapists would use. Now we often do teach them to patients, and certainly in couples therapy or parenting dynamics. But no, anybody can develop these skills. They're pretty straightforward. The information is just not readily available.
I was looking at your Instagram, and one of the posts is about, and I'm quoting, "We listen and we don't judge."
Mm.
Validation edition. So is that really what it's about? Listening and not judging? And what are the skills of listening, Caroline, as opposed to judging? And can one listen and judge? I mean, without wishing to be, excusing the pun here, too judgmental, is it bad to judge? I mean, are we not supposed to judge anything or anyone?
I mean, again, it depends what your aim is. And so if I am trying to help somebody feel seen or accepted, then judging them is not going to be in the service of that. Okay. If I need to decide between people I'm choosing to be on my team for a touch football game, then judgment is probably going to serve me well. But these skills, and I introduce 8 of them in the book, and they're broken down. You've got ones that are, for communicating mindfulness, some for understanding, if you've got that piece. And at the top, if you can also do empathy, I've got some skills for that. But at the most basic level, just attending, the skill that we use there is to have you, when somebody else is talking, think about what's this person's point and why does it matter to them? And more importantly, how could I do a better job of making this point? That qualifier there is quite important. But if you start listening and engaging with folks in that way as they speak, you will be focusing more on what they're saying and less on your rebuttal or what you want to get in there or where your mind wants to wander to figure out what's going on Severance or whatever. So within that, there isn't much judgment. There's curiosity.
I know your work is also, and the book focuses on being a better parent, raising emotionally, quote unquote, emotionally intelligent children. But at what point do our kids want us just to listen? Don't they require a degree of judgment? Otherwise, we fall into the trap of having these children who are never judged and seem, again, at least according to social psychologists like Jonathan Haidt, seem to be lost.
Okay, absolutely. So I'm so glad we're getting here. In my work as a therapist, just first and foremost, I always think when I'm talking to someone, they come to me with a problem or they're engaging in a behavior, self-harm, substance abuse, whatever you name it, and I have to, jump in there. I can either validate the person or problem solve. Okay. If I problem solve, I am trying to change. I might be trying to change how they think. I might be trying to change what they're doing. I might be trying to change how they feel. But problem solving is about, trying to resolve the situation in some way. Alternatively, validation just communicates some degree of understanding and acceptance. At any given moment, I can only respond with one or the other. But responding with one does not mean that I can't follow up with the other. And this is the point that was transformative to me and that I think is missing for a lot of folks, which is that if you want people to listen and take your advice, they need to feel like you understand what's going on. They need to feel seen. Okay? That will not undermine your efforts to be effective. It is sometimes the only way in which you can be.
Are you then, in a sense, turning your office out into the world, is you're turning all relationships into forms of therapy. Your book came with a nice blurb from Adam Grant, one of the great figures in social and nonfiction, social science writing.
Mhm.
He says, warning, this book will make you a better parent, partner, colleague, and friend. But is what you're saying and what Grant is suggesting is that we need to always behave as if we're talking with Caroline Fleck, not just Caroline Fleck, but Dr. Caroline Fleck, PhD?
Do they need to always behave as if they're talking to me?
As if,
No,
I mean, I'm not sure if you literally have a couch in your in your Los
I
Gatos
do.
office, but well, metaphorically or literally, does everyone need to be always on the couch if they're going to be, to borrow from Adam Grant, better parents, partners, colleagues, and friends?
Oh no, I mean, I don't think that you need to necessarily be in therapy to develop that capacity. However, there are tons of techniques, strategies, skills that have been developed for decades and have proven effective in all sorts of ways that anybody could develop. And I don't think you need to be in therapy to develop them, but I do think I think it's wise to consult the research on this stuff. And frankly, a lot of some of the more powerful interventions have been developed in the context of clinical psychology, where we're working with folks who are extremely hard to treat, right? Like getting someone to work out is hard enough, but if they're severely depressed, I mean, that is nearly impossible. And so when we find techniques that work in these really difficult scenarios, we need to kind of pay attention to what's going on there. And instead, what I've found is that that stuff rarely makes it mainstream, or at least it takes decades for it to kind of surface. And I can't help but wonder if that doesn't have something to do with the bias here around kind of mental health and mental illness, for sure.
Caroline, there's a new fashion, maybe not quite as new as sometimes we might think, for psychedelics, especially amongst the tech community
Yes.
in Europe and in Northern California. What's your take on psychedelics and validation? Does taking psychedelics help, hinder validation, or is it not really the point?
That's interesting. I was having a conversation with a friend just yesterday about this. I think what psychedelics can do is decrease people's the extent to which they see another person as threatening. Okay, and threat is typically the thing that gets in the way of us being able to validate others. All right. We're so focused on what's wrong, what we don't like, that we almost can't see past it. I mean, we have this innate negativity bias. We have evolved to focus on what is wrong in an environment in order to keep safe. Uh, that does not serve us terribly well in our relationships. So I think there's an argument to be made for the fact that if you can reduce that bias, if you can decrease the extent to which you see threat and dissatisfaction, it will be that much easier to connect, accept, and validate for sure.
Is your work really, is the sweet spot of your work on uh, solving conflict for couples? I know you've done a lot of work in that area.
It's a facet of my work. I wouldn't, that's the thing. This stuff just it any relationship, it's going to apply to. It's validation is often used in couples work because of how it functions in conflicts. So there are a couple of validation skills that have proven to be just like um, it's like putting an adorable cat filter on your face during a Zoom call. Like they just kind of like neutralize the tension and you become immediately less threatening. You appear less threatening to the person across from you. And so we teach clients how to validate during conflict because we know that it will decrease sympathetic arousal, bring down the heat, and increase the probability of resolution. So that's why it's so common in kind of the couples space.
Finally, Caroline, we did a show a few days ago with Gaia Bernstein. She teaches law at Seton Hall. She's a critic of big tech and particularly of AI. She's warning of the way in which these new AI agents are being marketed by big tech companies to talk with kids. And she's suggesting this would be catastrophic. I'm less interested in that and more curious as to your take on potentially the role of AI in validation. As we get more and more of these AI agents from all the big tech companies, a lot of your clients probably work for these tech companies. Are we going to see algorithms designed to validate? And is that something that you fear or you applaud?
That's a good question. When I've taken actually I put my entire book into Chat GPT and just said, based on this book, could you use this skill to validate this person or use that skill? And it's freakishly good. I think it is its own kind of algorithm. The skills kind of, that's how they function. By using the easier ones, you develop the understanding you need to use the higher ones. It's kind of a whole system, and it is freaky how much better machines are at picking that up than people. In terms of whether I applaud it or not, I really don't. I don't know. I don't think I'm in a position to weigh in yet on that. I do think there's no substitute for actual connection, and the easier it is to get an artificial connection, I think we're more likely to settle for that. But we're also less likely to develop the skills we need to reciprocate um, and develop those relationships on our own, because that AI dynamic is in one direction. You're getting everything you need and you're not required to give anything in return. And while that's lovely in the moment for not feeling so lonely, it's not a great long-term strategy for developing relationships.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Although I wonder whether you talk about the freaky or freakishly way in which Chat GPT digested your work and spat it back out. I wonder whether a culture which has simultaneously created Chat GPT and the psychology that you create, I wonder whether it's coincidental that they're in an odd way coming together.
That's very interesting. It is, and I actually know of folks in Silicon Valley here who are actively creating therapy bots and training them by using the exact same content that we train up therapists in, by basically just, again, kind of uploading those books. And it's they're not bad.
They're not bad in terms of morality or in terms of accuracy?
In terms of accuracy, like I'm seeing there's some interesting stuff out there. Of course, the problem is that the stakes are incredibly high, right? When you're talking about creating a bot that could intervene on, somebody who is suicidal or self-harming, you screw that up and the stakes are pretty high.
Isn't the biggest danger of all this, though, and we talked about this with Guy Bernstein as well, is that you've got your practice in Los Gatos. I'm not going to ask you your hourly rates, but I'm sure they're quite high. And there are many people in Los Gatos who can afford to go to Dr. Fleck and have this important engagement. But the problem is that with these therapy bots, it's going to be the poor, the underprivileged, people outside Los Gatos and Palo Alto who are going to be forced to engage with therapy bots.
Actually, we're already seeing this right now with online therapy. And so there's a lot of sites that have sprouted up in an effort to meet this very serious need in our country for mental health services. And what you're seeing oftentimes are clinicians who would not get licensed, or who are licensed, but would not be able to form a practice on their own because they are not good. And yet they are getting careers through working for these apps. And I think that has been the cost to that is that a lot of folks think they've had therapy because they've tried it through, I won't mention, you know,
But you
the
can if you want. I don't mind.
Talkspace or what have you. And often what they, then I see them, I'll see somebody who said, well, yeah, I did, I spent 6 months on talking to someone through talk. They did not have therapy. What they had was, I wouldn't even consider it talk therapy. And so the cost here is that people think they've received treatment and it hasn't worked for them, when in fact they haven't received treatment and they still need it. And you're right that this is a problem that is affecting people in rural communities and lower incomes more than others.
They need it. They need real therapists like Caroline Fleck rather than bot therapists. I wonder, finally, Caroline, whether this book, Validation, is in an odd way your attempt to validate yourself.
To validate my observation that validation is important?
Well, to validate your professional standing and the need for therapists as opposed to therapy bots.
Oh, that's interesting. I think I would hope that it validates the importance of us investing in figuring out how to communicate better, that this is a science. It should be a respected science just like any other, and that we are in desperate need of this information, and it's there. We just need to get it out.
Now, you've got it out with Validation, how the skill set that revolutionized psychology will transform your relationships, increase your influence, and in bold, change your life. So if you want to change your life, go to Caroline Fleck, read her book. Caroline, congratulations on the new book and very interesting conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.